Some men starve because they have nothing. Others because they cannot forgive themselves for what was taken at the table. Alessio Ferrante had not kept a full meal down in 14 months. Not since the night his wife reached across the white tablecloth at their anniversary dinner, smiled the way she always did when she thought he was eating too slowly, and lifted his fork to her own mouth. The risotto had been meant for him. She was dead before the ambulance crossed the bridge. He buried her on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the first therapist arrived. By Thursday, the nutritionist. By Sunday, the private physician from Zurich, who spoke in careful sentences about psychosomatic reflex arcs and conditioned esophageal rejection, and the clinical term for a body that had decided, on its own, that swallowing was no longer safe. None of it mattered. His throat closed the moment food touched his tongue. Not every time, and not completely. He could manage water, black coffee, the occasional piece of dry toast that he chewed until his jaw ached and swallowed like medicine. But anything with flavor, anything with warmth, anything that carried the kind of scent a kitchen produces when someone is cooking with care, his body refused it with a violence that left him gripping the edge of whatever table he was sitting at, eyes shut, breathing through the nausea until it passed. 7 specialists in 14 months. 3 countries. 1 overnight stay at a private clinic in Geneva, where a man with kind eyes and an expensive degree told him the problem was not his stomach. The problem was grief. The problem was guilt. The problem was that, somewhere inside his nervous system, the act of being fed had become indistinguishable from the act of watching someone die. He left Geneva the same morning and did not go back. The men around him noticed, of course. They always noticed. In his world, the body was a ledger that everyone read constantly, searching for entries that suggested weakness, decline, opportunity. Alessio Ferrante had run the Ferrante family since he was 29. He was 41 now, leaner than he had ever been, and the suits that had once fit like architecture now hung at the shoulders in a way his tailor could only partially disguise. He drank espresso at meetings where other men ate. He turned plates away with a single raised hand that no one dared question twice. He moved through rooms with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy he could no longer afford to spend. And Renzo Cattaneo, his consigliere, watched all of it with the patient attention of a man who understood that empires do not always fall from the outside. Sometimes they simply stop eating. On the night it changed, Alessio was in the back of a black sedan on the west side, heading nowhere in particular because sleep would not come, and motion was the only thing that quieted the restlessness that replaced hunger once the body gave up asking. His driver, Marco, a quiet Sicilian who had been with him for 9 years and who possessed the rare intelligence of knowing when to speak and when to simply drive, slowed the car near a block where most of the storefronts had already gone dark. One light was still on. It came from a narrow shopfront wedged between a closed laundromat and an apartment building entrance cluttered with delivery menus. The sign above the door read Corderos in hand-painted black letters, and below it, in smaller script, bread. Made here. The window was fogged from the inside, and through the condensation Alessio could see the shape of a woman moving behind a counter. The smell reached him before Marco even rolled the window down. Sourdough, butter, rosemary, something with olive oil and sea salt that carried through the November air like a sentence spoken too softly to ignore. His stomach did not close. That was the first thing he noticed. His stomach, which had spent 14 months locked behind a wall of reflex and grief, did not clench at the scent. It opened, not violently, not the way hunger arrives for healthy people, with its loud, uncomplicated demand. This was something smaller and stranger, a loosening, like a door that had rusted shut, giving way 1 millimeter at a time. "Stop the car!" Marco pulled over without asking why. He had been driving Alessio Ferrante for 9 years, and in those 9 years he had learned that the man's voice had exactly 3 modes. The low, steady frequency he used for instructions that could wait, the flat, empty tone he used for things that could not, and the rare, almost uncertain register that appeared when something inside him had shifted, and he did not yet know what to do about it. This was the third. Marco had heard it only twice before. Once at the hospital and once at the cemetery, and both times it had preceded events he preferred not to remember. The security detail in the follow car adjusted without communication. They had been doing this long enough to read the sedan's movements the way sailors read weather. Alessio sat still for a moment, one hand on the door, processing the unfamiliar sensation of his own body wanting something it had refused for over a year. The November wind carried another wave of the smell through the cracked window. Warm, yeasty, shot through with garlic and something green, possibly rosemary, possibly thyme, and his stomach opened another fraction. Then he got out. The block was quiet in the specific way Manhattan is quiet at 2 a.m. Not silent, never silent, but operating on a reduced frequency. The daytime orchestra scaled down to a skeleton crew of taxi engines, distant sirens, and the irregular percussion of someone somewhere always closing a door. The bakery was the only source of light for 200 feet in any direction, and the glow coming through its fogged window gave the sidewalk the amber warmth of a room where someone had been working for hours. The bakery was smaller than it looked from outside. 5 stools at a narrow wooden counter that had been sanded and oiled so many times, the grain had become a topographic map of use. Flour dust on the dark wooden floor, in patterns that told the story of how the baker moved. A dense drift near the oven, a lighter scatter near the register, 2 clean paths worn between them by years of the same feet making the same journey. A wall of shelved bread behind the register, each loaf resting on a rack like a book on a shelf, organized by some logic that was clear to the baker and invisible to everyone else. And a kitchen visible through a wide pass-through that let the heat and light spill into the front room like an open secret. There was no menu on the wall, no prices listed. A handwritten card taped to the register read, "If you have to ask what's fresh, you came too late." The woman behind the counter looked up when the door opened. She did not stop working. Her hands were deep in dough on a floured board, and she assessed him the way someone assesses an interruption. Not with fear, not with deference, but with the flat, measuring look of a person deciding whether the next 30 seconds of her life were about to be wasted. She was mid-30s, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair pulled back tight, flour on both forearms, a navy apron worn soft from washing, and the kind of face that had stopped trying to be anything other than exactly what it was. Not beautiful in the way that invited commentary. Beautiful in the way that made commentary irrelevant. "Kitchen closes in 40 minutes, she said. "Counter bread's on the shelf. Anything else, you wait." Alessio looked at her, then at the bread. Then at the kitchen behind her, where a second tray was cooling on a wire rack, and the air was so thick with warmth and yeast and olive oil that his lungs felt heavier just breathing it. "What is on that tray?" he said. It was not a question. Men like him had lost the habit of asking. She glanced over her shoulder without slowing her hands. "Focaccia, rosemary, garlic, Calabrian chili oil. I pull it in 10 minutes. I will wait." She looked at him again, at the suit, at the watch, at the 2 men visible through the fogged window who were clearly not waiting for bread, and her expression did not change. Not impressed, not afraid, not curious in the way most people became curious when faced with the particular weight that power put into a room. "Stool's there," she said, nodding toward the counter. "Don't touch the sourdough on the left. That's tomorrow's order." He sat. The 10 minutes passed in a silence that should have been uncomfortable, but was not. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this alone for years, moving between the oven, the counter, and the cooling rack, with a rhythm that never hesitated, never wasted a step. She did not look at him again. She did not try to make conversation. She did not glance at the men outside. When the focaccia came out of the oven, she slid it onto a wooden board, cut a wide square with a bench knife, laid it on a plain white plate with a pool of olive oil and a pinch of flaked salt, and set it in front of him without ceremony. "Eat it while it's angry," she said. "Bread doesn't forgive you for letting it cool." He looked at the plate. The steam rose thin and sharp, carrying rosemary, garlic, the low burn of chili. His hand moved before his mind gave permission. He tore a corner of the bread, pressed it into the oil, and brought it to his mouth. His throat opened, not with effort, Not with the grinding, controlled swallow that had turned every meal for 14 months into a negotiation between will and reflex. It simply opened, the way it had before the night that closed it, the way it was supposed to, the way the body works when it is not at war with itself. He chewed. He swallowed. The warmth hit his chest like a fist unclenching. He ate the entire piece without stopping. Then he sat with both hands flat on the counter and his eyes closed, breathing in a way that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with the strange, terrifying sensation of his own body, remembering what it felt like to accept nourishment from another person's hands. The woman had gone back to her dough. She was not watching him. She had not noticed, or if she had chosen not to make it into a moment, which was a kindness so precise, it almost hurt. He stayed for 40 minutes. She served him a second piece without being asked, then a small bowl of white bean soup that she said was for testing and not for sale, though the way she set it down suggested it was very much for sale. And she simply did not want to admit it. He ate that too. When he stood to leave, he reached into his coat for his wallet. $6, she said, without looking up from the counter she was wiping down. He set a $100 bill on the wood. She picked it up, examined it like it might be counterfeit, opened the register, made change for $94, and placed the bills and coins in a precise stack beside his plate. $6, she said again. The bread is good, but it is not $100 good, and if you think leaving more makes you generous, it does not. It makes you someone who did not listen the first time. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took the change, left $6 in exact bills, and walked out without saying thank you. She did not seem to expect it. And that was when she learned that feeding him was never about the bread. It was about teaching his body that the table was safe again. He came back, not the next night, but the night after, at the same hour. 2:14 in the morning. The sedan parked in the same place. The same man, Marco, stayed in the car. The same two shapes waited outside in the cold. She was pulling ciabatta from the oven when the door opened. She looked up, registered his face, and said, "Counter," the same way she might say it to anyone. He sat. She served him bread with olive oil and roasted garlic mashed into butter. He ate slowly. She did not watch. On the third night, she set down a plate of pasta. Short ribs, braised in red wine, torn basil, shaved pecorino, the kind of food that existed at the intersection of patience and instinct. He stared at it for a full minute before picking up the fork. The first bite took everything he had. The second came easier. By the time he set the fork down, the plate was empty, and his hands were shaking so slightly that only someone paying very close attention would have seen it. She was paying very close attention, but she said nothing about it. Instead, she took the plate, brought him a small cup of broth, and said, "Drink this. Your body isn't ready for that much richness yet. You need to earn your way back to real meals." It was the first time anyone had spoken to him about his condition, without clinical language, without pity, and without the careful political sensitivity that every person in his life applied to the subject of his eating, the way diplomats applied it to territorial disputes. She had simply looked at the evidence and told him the truth. "How long?" she said, not turning from the sink. 14 months. What happened? It was not a question. It was permission. He told her. Not everything. Not the name, not the family, not the world he moved through, or the enemies that populated it. But the dinner, the risotto, the fork lifted from his plate to her mouth, the way she had smiled just before the first tremor, like she thought she was having an allergic reaction, and found it almost funny. The hospital. The silence after. Marin Cordero, because that was her name, though he would not learn it for another 4 visits because she did not offer it and he did not ask, listened without facing him, her hands in the sink, her back straight, and when he finished, she dried her hands on her apron and said, "Your body isn't punishing you. It's protecting you. It thinks eating killed her, so it won't let you do it again." He said nothing. "The question," she continued, setting a clean towel on the counter with a care that seemed directed at more than the towel, "is whether you are going to let it keep making that decision for you." She didn't know it yet, but she had become the only proof in the world that Alessio Ferrante could still swallow without flinching. The visits became a pattern, and the pattern became a structure, and the structure became the closest thing to peace he had known since the night the risotto turned into a funeral. Every night at 2, sometimes earlier if the city had been difficult, sometimes later if the meetings ran long. Always the same stool, always bread first, because she had decided, without discussing it, that bread was the foundation, and everything else had to be built on top of it, in the right order. She introduced new foods the way a careful architect introduces weight to a structure, slowly testing each addition before committing to the next. Soup after bread, pasta after soup, fish after pasta, but only white fish, and only if the broth she had given him the night before had stayed down without trouble. She never asked him if he was hungry. She never offered a menu. She simply placed the food in front of him, based on a calculation she performed silently, reading his face, his hands, the speed of his breathing, the particular shade of exhaustion that sat behind his eyes on any given night. On the 6th night, she served him a bowl of ribollita, a Tuscan bread soup thick with white beans, cavolo nero, and the last of the morning's ciabatta, softened in stock until the bread dissolved into the broth and became something that was neither solid nor liquid, but both. He ate it in silence, and when he finished, she set a glass of water beside him and said, "Your color is better." He looked at her. "You were gray when you first walked in. Now you are merely pale. For a man who presumably does not spend much time in sunlight, pale is an improvement." He almost said something. She could see it form behind his eyes, and then retreat. Instead, he picked up the glass, drank the water, and set it down with a care that suggested the act of drinking in front of her had become, without either of them acknowledging it, a form of trust. On the 9th night, he arrived later than usual, 3:20 instead of 2, and his face was wrong. Not angry, not distressed, simply closed. The way a building is closed when the person who operates it has stepped out and locked the entrance and left no note about when they might return. Marin saw it immediately. She saw everything immediately. It was one of the things that made her extraordinary at her work and difficult at everything else. She did not serve him bread. She did not serve him soup. She set a cup of chamomile tea on the counter, with a small square of dark chocolate on the saucer, and said nothing. He looked at the tea. He looked at her. "Some nights," she said, not looking up from the dough she was shaping, "the body is not ready. That is not failure. That is information." He drank the tea. He did not touch the chocolate. He stayed for 90 minutes, and for the entire time, the only sounds in the bakery were the soft rhythm of her hands on dough, the low ticking of the oven timer, and the occasional passing car outside whose headlights swept across the ceiling like the beam of a lighthouse scanning water. When he left that night, he paused at the door and said, without turning, "The tea was good." "The tea," she said, "was tea. I make good bread. Tea is just hot water with an opinion." It was the closest either of them had come to humor, and the sound he made in response, not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of one, stayed with her long after the door closed. Some nights she served him nothing but bread and oil and a cup of chamomile tea, because she had decided, correctly, every time, that his body was not ready for more. On those nights, he sat longer. 40 minutes, an hour. Once, nearly 2 hours, during which she baked an entire batch of morning croissants without speaking to him. And the only sound in the room was flour, butter, and the low mechanical hum of the oven doing its work. On the good nights, the nights when his shoulders dropped within the first 10 minutes, and his breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm of a man who was not scanning for threats, she served him real food. Pappardelle with braised rabbit and lemon gremolata, grilled branzino with capers and roasted tomatoes, a simple frittata with potatoes and herbs that she made in a cast-iron skillet, older than she was, and that she trusted more than any piece of equipment she had ever owned. He ate each dish the way a man relearning a language speaks, carefully at first, with long pauses between words, and then with increasing fluency as the mouth remembered what the mind had forgotten. He learned things about her in pieces, the way bread rises, slowly, in warmth, and only if you do not press too hard. She had trained in a restaurant kitchen in the city, a good one, with a name people recognized, and a chef whose talent was real, but whose need for ownership was larger. She left after 2 years, when she realized that every dish she created arrived at the table under someone else's name, and that the particular alchemy she brought to food, the instinct, the timing, the way her hands knew what the recipe could not teach, was being consumed without credit and replicated without acknowledgement. She opened the bakery with money she had saved and a lease she had negotiated herself, and she ran it alone because she preferred the weight of solitude to the cost of compromise. She had no business partner, no investor, no family in the city. A younger sister in Philadelphia who called on Sundays, and a mother in New Mexico who sent dried chili peppers in the mail and worried about everything except the things that actually deserved worry. Her assistant, Lena, a 23-year-old pastry school dropout, who showed up one morning asking if she could watch, then stayed to learn, and now handled the early morning prep shift with a seriousness that Marin respected and a messiness that she did not, was the closest thing she had to staff, and Marin treated her the way certain women treat the next generation, with high standards, low sentimentality, and a loyalty that expressed itself through honesty rather than praise. Marco, the driver, began coming inside after the second week. Not to guard Alessio. The men outside handled that, but because Marin had noticed him sitting in the cold car for 2 hours every night and had sent Lena out with a cup of coffee and a bag of rolls with a message that said, "Tell the man in the sedan that freezing to death outside my shop is bad for my reputation." After that, Marco sat at the far end of the counter and ate quietly, and within a month, he and Lena had developed a rapport built entirely on bread recommendations and a shared, deeply felt suspicion that Alessio Ferrante had no idea how obvious his attachment had become. They were right. He did not. Or perhaps he did. But the particular dialect of self-awareness available to men who have spent their entire adult lives being feared does not include vocabulary for the experience of needing a woman who makes bread and does not care who he is. The first crack in the pattern came on a Sunday afternoon in December. Alessio had never come during daylight. Daylight meant witnesses, meant the world he operated in, meant the careful separation he maintained between the man who sat at Marin's counter and the man whose name made rooms go quiet. But on that Sunday, something had happened. She never learned what, and she never asked, that brought his car to the curb at 4 p.m, when the bakery was still open and the last of the morning customers were finishing their coffee. He stood on the sidewalk for nearly a minute before he came in. She saw him through the window, his coat collar up against the December wind, his hands in his pockets, his face turned toward the bakery sign with an expression she had never seen on him before. Hesitation. Not fear, not calculation, but the genuine, human uncertainty of a man standing at the threshold of a decision he could not undo. Then he walked in. 3 customers were at the counter. A woman with a sleeping infant in a carrier. A college student with headphones and a notebook. An older man who came every Sunday for the olive bread, and who had once told Marin that her focaccia reminded him of his mother's kitchen in Calabria, which was the highest compliment she had ever received, and the only one that had ever made her eyes sting. All 3 looked up when Alessio entered. The college student looked away. The woman with the infant shifted slightly, the way people shift when they sense something in a room they cannot name. The older man looked at Alessio, looked at Marin, and returned to his bread with the particular discretion of a man who had lived long enough to know when not to notice things. Marin said, "Counter," the same way she always said it. He sat. She served him bread. The afternoon light fell across his hands, and she saw them clearly for the first time, not in the amber haze of the bakery's night fixtures, but in full, honest daylight. They were scarred. Not dramatically, not in ways that told stories, but marked the way hands are marked when they have spent years doing things that the rest of the body would prefer to forget. He ate the bread, he drank a cup of coffee, he stayed for 30 minutes. And when he left, the older man at the counter watched him go, then turned to Marin and said in heavily accented English, "That man, he looks at your bread the way my father looked at the ocean. like it is the only thing in the world bigger than his trouble. Marin said nothing. But she thought about that sentence for the rest of the day, and again that night, and again the next morning when the flower delivery arrived and the routine she had built began to feel less like a pattern and more like a life. Renzo Cattaneo noticed. It took 6 weeks for the reports to reach him properly. 6 weeks during which Alessio's color returned, his weight stabilized, and the suits began fitting again in a way that made the tailor smile and the consigliere calculate. Because Renzo had spent 14 months building infrastructure on the assumption that Alessio's decline was permanent. Alliances had been redirected. Revenue streams had been quietly rerouted. A marriage arrangement with the Fontana pharmaceutical family was 3 signatures away from finalization. A marriage that required Alessio to be weak, isolated, and dependent on the organizational support that only Renzo could provide. A woman who could make him eat was not a romantic complication. It was a structural threat. The first move was bureaucratic. A health inspector arrived at Cordero's on a Tuesday morning with a clipboard and an expression that suggested the outcome had been decided before he walked in. He found 17 violations, 6 of which did not exist, and the remaining 11 of which existed in every bakery in the borough and had never once been cited. Marin read the list, looked up at the man, and said, "My last 3 inspections are framed on the wall behind you. A grade, every one. If you would like to cite me for a dirty drain catch, you are welcome to. But I will appeal, and I will win, and you will have made the trip for nothing." The inspector left. The violations were filed. Marin appealed, and she won. And the entire process cost her $400 in filing fees and 12 hours she could not afford to lose. She did not mention it to Alessio. The second move was financial. A man in a good suit and better shoes arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with an offer to purchase the bakery at 10 times its assessed value. Cash. No conditions. Immediate closing. Marin listened to the number, looked at the man's shoes, looked at his face, and said, "No, the offer is very generous, Miss Cordero." "The offer," she said, placing both hands flat on her counter in a gesture that Alessio would have recognized immediately, "is not for the bakery. It is for my silence about something I do not yet understand, and I do not sell things I have not been told the price of." The man left. The offer was not repeated. She mentioned this one to Alessio. Not as a complaint, not as a plea for protection, but as a fact, delivered over bread at 2 a.m. with the same flat precision she applied to everything. "Someone wants to buy my bakery," she said. "Who?" "A man in expensive shoes who did not know the difference between sourdough and brioche." Which tells me he was not sent by anyone who cares about bread. Alessio set down his fork. The temperature in the room changed in the way it changed when he stopped being the man at the counter and became the man whose name made other men step back. "Did he give you a name?" "He gave me a card. Alberici Capital Partners. I looked them up. The company has existed for 11 months and has no other visible clients." He took the card. He said nothing else about it that night. But when he left at 3:40, the door closed harder than usual, and Marco drove faster than the streets required. What happened next was not loud, and it was not violent, and it did not arrive in the form Marin had been bracing for. There was no broken glass, no men with guns, no dramatic confrontation in her kitchen. What happened was quieter and, in its way, more devastating. Alessio called a council meeting. It was the first he had called, rather than attended, in 11 months. The invitation went out on a Thursday to every senior member of the Ferrante organization, and the location was not the usual hotel conference room or the restaurant in Brooklyn, where such things traditionally occurred. It was held at Cordero's. Marin learned this at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, when Marco knocked on her back door and said, with the apologetic expression of a man delivering news he knew would not be received well, he would like to use the space tomorrow evening for a dinner. He says to tell you he will pay the standard rental rate, and that you are welcome to refuse. How many people? 12. 12 men who work for him are going to sit in my bakery and eat dinner. Yes, she stood in her kitchen with flour on her hands and considered the geometric improbability of her life. Then she said, "Tell him the rental rate is $2,000, the menu is mine, and if any of his associates touch my sourdough starter, I will remove them myself." Marco, who had by that point eaten enough of her bread to understand that this was not a joke, nodded and left. What happened in that kitchen was not a rescue. It was a return. The dinner was held on a Friday evening. Maren spent all of Thursday night and most of Friday morning preparing. Not because the food was difficult. She had been making this kind of food since she could stand on a stool and reach the counter, but because she understood, in the way that women who build things understand, that this dinner was not about food. It was about proof. And proof required perfection. She baked 3 kinds of bread. The focaccia that had started everything, a dark ciabatta with a crust that crackled when you broke it, and a new rye loaf she had been developing for 3 months, in secret, dense, sour, threaded with caraway and fennel seed, the kind of bread that demanded to be taken seriously. She tested it 4 times before she was satisfied. Lena, who had been told only that a private event was happening and not why, watched her taste the rye for the 5th time and said, "If you adjust that recipe again, I am going to eat the entire batch myself, and you will have nothing to serve." Maren looked at her. Then she set the bread down and said, "Set the tables. Lena, set the tables." 12 men arrived at 7 o'clock, entering in pairs through the front door that Maren had propped open, because the idea of buzzing in a dozen men in dark suits one at a time felt absurd. They were younger than she had expected, most of them. 30s and 40s, expensive shoes, quiet hands, the kind of faces that had been trained to reveal nothing and succeeded most of the time. A few of them looked around the bakery with the poorly disguised surprise of men who had expected something larger, something more impressive, something that justified the inconvenience of crossing the bridge for dinner. One man, older, silver-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime in the previous century, studied the handwritten card on the register that read, "If you have to ask what's fresh, you came too late," and the corner of his mouth twitched in a way that could have been amusement or could have been assessment. With men like him, Maren had learned, the two were often the same thing. Renzo Cattaneo arrived last. He was taller than she had imagined, slim in the way that suggested discipline rather than genetics, with gray at the temples and a face that had been handsome once and had since been refined into something more useful, trustworthy, measured, and almost entirely unreadable. He shook her hand at the door with the courtesy of a man who had been taught manners as a weapon, and the pressure of his grip told her everything the courtesy tried to hide. He did not like being here. He did not like that this room existed. And he did not like her. She smiled the way she smiled at customers who complained about the bread being too crusty, with patience, without apology, and said, "Your seat is at the far end." Lena had pushed the tables together into a single long configuration that took up the entire front room. White paper over the wood, no tablecloth, no flowers, no pretension. The bread was laid out in baskets at intervals. The olive oil was in small ceramic dishes that Maren had bought from a woman at the market who made them by hand. And the lighting came from the bakery's existing fixtures, which cast a warm, uneven glow that made the room feel less like a boardroom and more like a home. That was deliberate. Everything Maren did in her kitchen was deliberate. Alessio sat at the head. He arrived after the others, which she understood was not about dramatics but about the particular choreography of power. The boss enters last so that the room has time to arrange itself around his absence before he fills it. He wore the same dark suit she had seen 100 times, but something about the way he carried it tonight was different. His shoulders were not down the way they dropped at her counter at 2 a.m. They were set. His jaw was set. His eyes moved over the room with the slow, calibrating sweep of a man about to make a statement that did not require words. He sat. The room settled. And when the food arrived, he ate. The first course was white bean soup with rosemary oil and a thread of lemon zest that caught the light. Maren had made it deliberately simple. Nothing that could overwhelm. Nothing that could trigger the reflex. Because the soup was not the point. The soup was permission. It was Alessio telling his body, in front of 12 witnesses, that the table was no longer a battlefield. He finished the bowl. He set the spoon down. And then he reached for the bread, not the focaccia. The rye. The new one. The bread she had never served publicly, The bread she had tested 5 times. The bread that Lena had threatened to eat. He tore it with his hands, pressed it into the oil, and ate it without hesitation. The main course arrived next. Braised short ribs over hand-cut pappardelle with shaved pecorino and toasted breadcrumbs. The smell filled the room the way a sentence fills a page. Completely. Irrevocably. Leaving no space for anything else. Marin watched from the kitchen pass through. She was not supposed to be watching. She was supposed to be plating the next course. But she could not look away from the sight of Alessio Ferrante eating a full meal. Not bread, not broth, not the careful, graduated portions she had been building him toward night after night, but an entire dinner. Every course, the fork moving steadily from plate to mouth in the easy, unthinking rhythm of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to fight the table. He ate the way a man eats when he is no longer at war with himself. He used the bread to clean the last of the sauce from his plate. He did this without looking up, without acknowledging the room, without making it a performance. And that restraint, the absolute, total refusal to turn his recovery into theater, was the most powerful thing she had ever witnessed in her kitchen. 12 men watched him do it. And every man at that table understood what he was seeing without a single word being spoken. The boss was back. The boss was eating from a woman's kitchen and keeping it down, and not flinching, and not sweating, and not pressing his hand to his stomach like a man negotiating with his own body for permission to survive. The silver-haired man at the center of the table reached for the breadbasket, tore a piece of the rye, and ate it. Then the man beside him did the same. Within 2 minutes, every man at the table was eating, and the room had transformed from a political event into something that looked, from the outside, almost like a family dinner. Almost. Renzo Cattaneo sat at the opposite end of the table. His plate was full. His fork had not moved. His water glass was untouched. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on Alessio, with the particular stillness of a man watching a door close that he cannot reopen. Marin saw it. She saw every second of it, and she understood, with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of reading kitchens, reading heat, reading timing, reading the difference between a man who is hungry and a man who is merely present, that Renzo Cattaneo had just lost something he could not get back. And he knew it, and there was nothing in the world he could do about it except sit very still and pretend his appetite was the problem. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and Lena was washing dishes in the back with a focus that suggested she knew exactly how important the evening had been, Alessio remained at the table. The other men filed out in pairs and groups, each one nodding to Marin as they passed in the particular way men nod to a woman they have just realized is not a guest in the room, but the reason it exists. The silver-haired man stopped at the door. He looked at her for a moment, then at the kitchen behind her, then back at her face. "The rye," he said. "Your recipe? My grandmother's base. My ratios." He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has confirmed something he already suspected, and left. Renzo was the last to stand. He buttoned his jacket with the precision of a man performing a ritual he had done 10,000 times, looked at Alessio, looked at Marin, and said nothing. His silence was louder than anything that had been spoken all evening. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him with a click that sounded, to Marin's ears, like the last line of a story she had not known she was reading. 3 days later, Renzo Cattaneo resigned from his position as consigliere of the Ferrante family. The official reason was health. The unofficial reason moved through the organization the way all real information moves. In whispers, in glances, in the sudden recalibration of loyalty that occurs when men realize the power they had been serving was borrowed, and the man they had been underestimating had simply been waiting for the right moment to sit down and eat. The Fontana marriage arrangement was dissolved. The redirected revenue streams were corrected. And Renzo left the city in the quiet, permanent way that powerful men leave when they understand that staying is no longer an option, and that the alternative to leaving is something no one will discuss directly. Marin never asked Alessio what happened to Renzo. She did not need to. She understood the grammar of his world well enough to read the sentence, and she had decided early on that the specific vocabulary was not hers to demand. What she demanded instead was simpler and harder. That he keep showing up. That he eat. That he sit at her counter at 2 a.m. and let his shoulders come down, and let the bread be bread, and let the silence be silence, and let the woman behind the counter be a woman, and not a symbol of whatever war he was fighting inside himself. He met every demand. The weeks after Renzo's departure were quieter than she expected. She had braced for aftermath, for retaliation, for complications, for the kind of collateral damage that powerful men's exits always leave behind. But there was nothing. The inspectors did not return. The men in good shoes did not come back with new offers. The bakery sat on its corner, undisturbed, as if the city itself had been informed that the building and everything inside it were no longer subjects available for negotiation. The only change she noticed was the flour. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. 3 50-pound bags of organic stone-ground wheat from a mill in upstate New York that she had been reading about for 2 years, but could never justify the cost of ordering from. The delivery driver, a young man in a green jacket, who clearly did not usually deliver to this neighborhood, set the bags inside the back door and handed her a receipt that listed no sender and no return address. Maren stood in her kitchen, holding the receipt and feeling, for the first time since the night his car stopped outside her window, the full weight of what it meant to be known by a man who expressed care the way other people expressed violence, precisely, without warning, and in a language only the recipient could read. She did not thank him for the flour. He did not expect her to. But the next night, when he sat at the counter at 2 a.m, she served him bread made from it, and the look he gave her when he tasted the difference, a look that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with recognition, was thanks enough for both of them. The months that followed were not dramatic. They were built in the small, steady way that real things are built, with flour and heat, and the accumulated trust of 2 people who had both learned, separately and painfully, that the only structures worth living in are the ones you construct with your own hands. Maren's bakery grew. Not because Alessio funded it. She refused his money with a consistency that would have been insulting if it were not so clearly principled, but because the food was extraordinary, and the room was hers, and people trusted both. Morning lines formed. A review appeared in a paper she had never heard of, written by someone who had come in at 2 a.m. and stayed until 4, and described the bread as the kind of thing that makes you forgive the city for everything else it has done to you. She expanded the morning menu: eggs poached in tomato sauce, served with torn focaccia and a side of greens, dressed in nothing but lemon and olive oil. She added a small display case near the register for pastries, not because she loved pastry work, but because Lena did. And Maren had learned, long ago, that the fastest way to grow a kitchen was to let the people inside it cook what they loved. The pastries sold out by 9 every morning. Lena graduated from assistant to Sue's baker, and on the morning Maren handed her the key to the back door, her own key, not a copy, Lena stood very still for a moment, and then said, "You know Marco asked me to dinner." And Maren said, "I know. Go, but if you're late tomorrow, I'm changing the locks." "He is very serious," Lena said, which could have meant the invitation or the man himself. "So am I," Maren answered. "About the locks," but she smiled when she said it. And Lena knew, the way women who work together in small kitchens always know, that the smile was not about the locks at all. Marco, for his part, continued to sit at the far end of the counter on nights when Alessio was there, though his attention had migrated permanently from the bread to the kitchen, where Lena worked with flour in her hair, and a seriousness that made him forget he was supposed to be watching the door. It was Maren who noticed first that their little bakery had become something she had not planned for, a household, not a formal one, not the kind built on documents and ceremonies and shared addresses, but the kind built on shared rhythms and accumulated trust and the particular intimacy of people who feed each other without keeping score. Alessio at the counter, Marco at the end stool, Lena in the kitchen, the flour seller from the market next door, a woman named Diane who had decided on the basis of no evidence whatsoever that Marco was the love of her life, and that his relationship with Lena was simply a misunderstanding that would resolve itself in time, who came by every Thursday with an arrangement of whatever was left at the end of the day and set it on the counter without being asked. Even the delivery driver in the green jacket had become a regular, stopping by on his morning route for coffee and a roll, and the kind of brief, warm exchange that strangers have when they recognize each other as neighbors, even if they have never lived on the same street. It was not a family in any shape Marin would have designed, but it was warm, and it was real, and it showed up at the same time every day, and that counted for more than she had ever expected it to. One night in February, 5 months after the council dinner, Alessio arrived earlier than usual, 11:30 instead of 2. The kitchen was still running. Marin was in the middle of a batch of brioche dough that required her full attention, and she did not look up when the door opened. "Counter," she said. "No," he said. She looked up. He was standing at the pass-through, not at the counter. His coat was off, his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his hands were empty and open in a way that suggested he was about to do something he had not done in a very long time. "I want to cook," he said. She stared at him. "You want to cook? In your kitchen." "My kitchen, yes." She set the dough scraper down and looked at him with the expression she reserved for ideas that were either brilliant or catastrophic, and that she could not yet tell apart. "What are you going to cook?" "Risotto." The word landed between them like a coin dropped on stone. Risotto, the dish that killed his wife, the dish that had closed his throat for 14 months, the dish that had turned eating into an act of survival rather than pleasure. Marin did not react. She did not flinch, did not soften, did not say any of the careful therapeutic things that 7 specialists in 3 countries would have said. She simply looked at him, measured him the way she measured flour, precisely, without sentiment, and said, "Arborio is on the 2nd shelf. Stock is in the walk-in. Touch my sourdough starter and I will end you." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. She gave him the corner station, the one near the window where the light was best and the counter was widest, and went back to her brioche. She did not watch him. She did not offer guidance. She did not hover the way the specialists had hovered, waiting for signs of distress, monitoring his breathing, treating his body like a patient rather than a person. She worked her dough. He worked his. The rice hit the hot pan with a sound she recognized from 1,000 kitchens. The sharp sizzle of starch meeting fat. The first step in a process that required patience and attention and the willingness to stand still and stir for 20 minutes without rushing. He added the stock 1 ladle at a time. He stirred with his right hand and held the pan steady with his left. His breathing was even. His jaw was set, but not locked. His shoulders were down. She glanced over once, just once, at the 12-minute mark, and saw that his hands were steady. At 22 minutes, he turned off the flame. He plated the risotto in a wide, shallow bowl, the same kind of bowl his wife had eaten from, though Marin did not know this, and he did not tell her, and set it on the counter between them. 2 forks. She set down her dough scraper, wiped her hands on her apron, picked up a fork, and took a bite. It was good. Not extraordinary. His technique was rusty, and he had oversalted the stock slightly. But it was good in the honest, structural way that food is good when it is made by a person who understands what they are doing and why they are doing it. "Too much salt," she said. "I know. The rice is perfect. I know that, too." She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the silence of that kitchen, standing over a plate of risotto that had taken 14 months and 7 specialists and 3 countries and 1 woman with flour on her hands to make possible, something settled between them that had been unsettled since the first night he walked through her door. He picked up his fork. He ate, not carefully, not with the measured, clinical attention he had applied to every meal she had served him for the past 4 months. He ate the way a man eats when he has decided, finally and completely, that the table is not a place where people die. It is a place where people come back to life. When the plate was empty, he set the fork down and said, "I used to cook for her every Sunday." She said, "My risotto was the only thing in the world I made better than anyone else." Marin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some confessions do not require a response. They require a witness. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Thank you for not making this into something." Into what? A breakthrough. A moment. A victory. She picked up the empty plate, carried it to the sink, and said, over her shoulder, "It is Tuesday. I have brioche to finish. If you are going to stand there being emotional, at least wipe down the counter you used." He wiped down the counter, and when she glanced back, she saw that his shoulders had dropped the last half-inch they had been holding, and that his eyes, for the first time since she had known him, were completely still. One night, after close, when the ovens were off, and the counter was clean, and the city outside had finally gone quiet in the way it only does between 3 and 4 in the morning, Alessio stayed on his stool while Maren counted receipts at the register. "I don't come for the bread anymore," he said. She did not look up. "I know." "When did you know?" "Week 3. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you keep feeding me?" She set the receipts down, looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him the first night, with that flat, measuring honesty that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with respect, and said, "Because you were starving, and I had bread, and in my kitchen, that is a simple equation." It was never simple. "No," she said, "but the bread was. And sometimes you start with what is simple and let the rest catch up." He stood. He came around the counter. He stopped close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and the cold night air still caught in the wool of his coat. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "That my body was protecting me. That it thought eating killed her. And now?" He lifted one hand and placed it against the side of her face, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who knew exactly what he was asking permission for, and would not take it without the answer. "Now," he said, "it knows the difference." She did not close her eyes. She looked at him, looked into him, with the same clarity she brought to bread and fire and business and every other thing in her life that she refused to do halfway. Then she kissed him. It was not gentle, and it was not careful, and it was not the kind of kiss that belonged in a flour-dusted bakery at 3 in the morning, with a stack of receipts on the counter, and a woman who had spent 3 months rebuilding a man's relationship with food, and had somehow, without planning it, or wanting it, or asking for it, also rebuilt his relationship with being alive. But it was theirs, and it was real. And when they broke apart, both breathing harder than the silent room deserved, he lowered his forehead to hers and said, in the quietest voice she had ever heard him use, "I am not a safe man." "I am not a safe woman," she answered. "I threw a health inspector out of my shop. I think we are well matched." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. And the sound of it, low, surprised, almost unwilling, made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with pain. A year later, people told the story wrong, because people always prefer the version that fits neatly into a sentence. They said she healed Alessio Ferrante with a loaf of bread, as if healing were ever that clean, as if men like him changed in a single beautiful moment, as if the woman who did the work deserved to be reduced to an ingredient in someone else's mythology. The truth was messier and better. She fed him once, and then again, until his body remembered that the table was not a place where people died. He kept showing up until her kitchen stopped being a place he visited and became the only place where his shoulders ever fully dropped. Her bakery grew because the food was extraordinary, and the woman behind it did not bend, and he loved both of those things with an intensity that frightened him more than anything his world had ever produced. Some nights after close, he stood beside her drying dishes badly while she counted the day's take, and she would look over at the most feared man in the city with soap on his hands and flour on his sleeve and think that happiness really was strange, because it had not arrived gently, and it had not arrived safely, and it had certainly not arrived in a shape she would have chosen if anyone had asked. Her mother sent chili peppers from New Mexico every month now, packed in brown paper with notes written in a handwriting that had not changed since Maren was 6. The notes never mentioned Alessio by name. They said things like, "I hear the bakery is doing well. I hear you are not alone anymore. I hear this from your sister, who hears this from God knows where. Send me a photo of whoever is making you sound less tired on the phone. Marin never sent the photo. But she started using the chilies in a new bread, a sourdough with roasted New Mexico green chili and sharp cheddar that became the bakery's bestseller within a week, and that Alessio, after tasting it for the first time, called the only bread in the world that fought back. He made risotto on Sundays now. In her kitchen, with her pans with arborio rice he bought himself and stock he made from scratch, because she had told him once that a man who uses boxed stock in a professional kitchen deserves whatever happens to him next. He had started adding her mother's chili peppers to the sofrito, just a pinch, barely enough to register, and the first time she tasted the heat, she looked at him and said nothing, and he looked at her and said nothing. And the silence between them held more than any word either of them knew how to say, but it had arrived. And once it had, he did exactly what she always knew a man like him would do when he finally found his way back to the table. He ate. And for the first time in 14 months, he did not taste the poison. If that kept you listening until the very end, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.